Hi everyone, this is Frank from Heritage, Ohio. I want to let you know we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Frank Quinn from Heritage, Ohio. It's Wednesday at 1 p.m. Thank you so much for joining me for our monthly webinar. So today we are talking about easements, and easements being a very effective tool to help in your preservation efforts for historic buildings. So we'll cover a few items today. We're going to look at what an easement is, how that easement agreement legally protects a building. We're going to look at how Heritage Ohio's easement program works in practice, a little bit of that. We'll also touch on the Internal Revenue Service, everyone's favorite governmental agency, and how they view easements. And then we'll also touch on how easements are monitored in perpetuity and how requests for alterations to buildings are considered. So I also want to let you know that at our upcoming conference in Cleveland, we'll also be discussing easements. So if you're going to be up there in Cleveland joining us, set aside Tuesday, October 23rd, beginning at 2 o'clock for an easement session. I also want to warn you, if you joined me back in May, or if you know about my experience with webinars, then you know that Frank's first law of webinar tragedies is that anything that can go wrong with the webinar usually will go wrong with the webinar, but I have my fingers crossed today that everything is going to work out super. So if you have signed up and you would like AIA credits, because we're offering LU credits for this webinar, just email me, fquinn@heritageohio.org. Let me know if you'd like a certificate. We'll have question and answer at the end of the session. Let me know your questions, and hopefully we have some good discussion. Finally, Heritage Ohio webinars are a benefit of membership, and our membership starts at only $35. But please join our Legacy Circle. Membership starts at $150. We would be ever so grateful. If you are a Heritage Ohio member today and you're listening to this webinar, thank you very much. So without further ado, let's jump into easements and the easement process. So as I mentioned, 4 points that we're going to look at today. It's important that we start out with some basics, all right? So for the blanket disclaimer part of this webinar, yes, I am the Director of Preservation for Heritage Ohio, but I am not an attorney or a tax accountant or a structural engineer or an architect or a certified appraiser. And there's no substitute for surrounding yourself with experienced professionals when it comes to donating an easement. So please make sure to consult those experts so you are making informed decisions. So obviously, I want you to remember this concept. Property ownership you can look at it as a bundle of rights that comes with property ownership. And so each right is like a cigarette in that guy's mouth. You have a whole bundle of rights that come with the property. However, some or all of those rights may have been transferred or bargained away at some point. Actually, that's kind of gross. There, that's better. So actually, property ownership is kind of like a bundle of straws. So you as a guy or gal on the deed, you own the property, but there are a whole host of rights, a bundle of rights that can be transferred. So some may have been transferred out of an owner's control literally 100 years ago. Consider things like mineral rights. You know, an owner transferred the rights for someone to mine on your property a long time ago. Air rights. Airplanes can fly in the space overhead over your property. Power lines, electric power transmission. A long time ago, the electric company probably filed an easement on your property to allow it to use its power lines. Along with those rights, you have to look at the governmental part of it. So you own a property, but a governmental entity can come in and use eminent domain to take control of your property. Luckily, the Fifth Amendment, I think it is, spells out the requirement of just compensation if your property is taken from you. And then there are all of those voluntary additional third-party rights. And under those third-party rights, we look at the easements. So, and that's kind of our special interest today. It's when your right as a property owner to control what you do with the property's historic elements that you voluntarily give up that right and give control over what you do to a third party such as Heritage Ohio. So back to our image, that handsome devil in the lower right, Heritage Ohio, is now smoking the cigarette that controls the right over what you can do with the property's historic elements. Or actually, I mean that little fellow there in the lower right took the straw that controls the right over what you can do with a property's historic elements. So what is that easement exactly? So it's at its most basic, it's a legal agreement between an owner, the donor of the easement, and Heritage Ohio, the recipient of the easement. And it's an agreement that runs in perpetuity. And perpetuity is a very long time. So this means that the owner or owners in Heritage Ohio have to have a good working relationship because both parties are now, in a sense, married to this property. Or the kid is the building and Heritage Ohio and the owners are the parents. However you choose to look at it, we're entering into serious business. So once that easement is donated, the property owner is required to uphold the terms of the easement. Basically, that requirement is to keep the property in good repair and to preserve its historic character. Sometimes you get road property owners, they don't do that, and we have a situation like this, where we go from the before of the pretty building to the after of the grassy lot. In other words, the building protected by the easement has been demolished. If something like that happens, then we as the easement holder are legally obligated to uphold the terms of the easement to basically make the situation whole. So in other words, the owner may be forced to rebuild the structure on the site with his or her own money. Thankfully for us personally, Heritage Ohio, we've never had to deal with this kind of issue before. Knock on wood. So why would you want to donate an easement? So I can think of three good reasons off the top of my head. One is that you've made a significant investment in a property and you don't want to see a future owner undo that investment. But instead you want them to maintain and steward that investment forward to the next owner. So kind of like in our lower left, we have a property owner who has spent a good deal of money rehabbing a property, and they don't just want the next owner to come in and tear it down and build something else on the site. We might also have a case where what if you have a property that's located within a design review district? So you think to yourself, "Woo, I can breathe easy now that my property will, or knowing that my property will always be protected." But that's not always the case. Just like a municipality can legislate design review into existence, the municipality can also legislate it out of existence. So there may be zoning that exists, but zoning parameters can and do change. So in that event, your reliance on the local government to help protect your building may not be on such solid footing. Last good reason to donate an easement is that you may be able to take advantage of tax incentives. So it's also important to note what an easement means, what it typically does and does not do. So let's start with it does not. That easement does not absolve the property owner from ongoing maintenance responsibilities. Sometimes you might have a property owner who thinks that because they've donated an easement that it's Heritage Ohio or that organization that is taking the responsibility for not only enforcing the preservation, but then to also enforce the maintenance of those elements. And that is not the case. An easement also does not turn your building into a public museum. You are not required to, if you donate an easement, you're not required to open your building up for tours on a monthly basis or anything like that. Nor does an easement magically rescue neglected buildings. So what an easement does is that it protects the integrity of the historic resource, because that accountability, that responsibility has been given to a third party, going back to that bundle of straws analogy. That easement does protect the time and money you've invested in the building, as I mentioned, why you would want to take an easement or donate an easement. It can possibly provide a financial incentive to the owner. We'll get into that a little bit more. And it does require, there's a component of public appreciation or enjoyment, kind of like from an arts and culture standpoint, but that allowing that public appreciation or enjoyment, as I say, can be as easy as allowing visual access from a public roadway. So for Heritage Ohio, our easement program has been around since 2004. And I guess if you look at those numbers, we have averaged about one easement per year. We have easements throughout the state of Ohio. We do not have easements in Cleveland. We have partners in Cleveland who have established easement programs, and they are just fine operating their programs, so we're not in Cleveland. Just as a bit of trivia, our first easement was accepted on a building, like a Main Street downtown building in Finley, Ohio. So that's the cover page from an actual easement agreement that we have executed. And so I want to make sure that you understand that that easement agreement, it's a legal document, it's a deed, it's signed by all the parties, it's notarized, it's recorded at the county auditor's office, and it becomes part of the chain of title for the property. And just like any other easement that isn't time limited, it runs in perpetuity. So that legal document, once filed, Heritage Ohio is the owner of the interest in the property that dictates how that historic character is maintained and preserved. So going back to that easement, what it is, a basic agreement protects all of the exterior of the building. It may include loss of development rights, which we will get into here in just a moment. It may include the protection of significant interior areas. We do have one easement that is an exterior easement and also protects interiors. An easement, I guess you could go to the point of protecting works of art. You could include pieces of furniture in the easement agreement. It's really just dependent on how intensive of an easement that owner wants to place on the building, and whether from our standpoint we feel that we can adequately administer those easement components. And as I mentioned, the IRS views the donation of that easement as having the potential as a charitable contribution to a nonprofit organization. So it's as if I wrote a check to Heritage Ohio for $100 and I could take a charitable contribution off my taxes of a tax deduction of $100, the same concept is at play when you donate an easement. So it's important to note that it's, gosh, what's the right term for it? It's a straightforward process, but it's each easement donation is unique. It's different. There are different factors coming into play. And so anytime that we have an easement application coming in, it's carefully discussed and vetted through our staff, through our easement committee, and through our Heritage Ohio Board of Trustees. It's our Board of Trustees that gives the final say-so on whether an easement will be or won't be accepted for our organization. And as I know, again, it's an agreement that runs in perpetuity, so we're taking the responsibility to, as I mentioned, we're considering our forever relationship with the building and with a current owner, and for that unknown, whatever future owners we might be working with in subsequent generations. So very important that we're carefully evaluating whether this is in the best interest of everyone who's involved in the project. So for Heritage Ohio, when an easement donation is made, we include some different fees. We have an easement application fee. We have a donation fee when that actual easement agreement is executed. And then on an annual basis, we have a monitoring fee for the easement. And so why do we collect fees on the easement? The fees go towards our legal defense fund, and they also help us defray the costs of staff time, site visits, technical assistance. So very critical that an organization has that legal defense fund, because if you remember back to our before building, our magical after of the grassy lot, what happens to an organization if in the future we run into a building owner who's very obstinate, a building owner who negligently demolishes a building, which has happened unfortunately to other organizations in the past. If we have to litigate, or if we have to basically litigate or sue that building owner in order to uphold the components of the easement, one court case can easily add up to 6 figures, and you need to have that legal defense fund so you can be ready to fight a case and be ready to litigate a case, especially if it drags on. So as I mentioned, this is a little bit more happy topic, even though it is the IRS. So the IRS looks at the donation of that easement as comparable to a charitable contribution. So the building owner could realize a tax deduction on income tax. Also, the fees associated that I had mentioned with the application fee, the donation fee, monitoring fee, those may also be tax deductible expenses. Consult your tax Attorney, surprise, or exclamation point, very important. So also an important issue on that tax eligibility with the tax deduction. If you want to take advantage of those tax incentives, the building has to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The building can either be listed on its own or as a contributing resource within a district. And then, of course, you need to have sufficient tax liability to be able to take advantage of the incentive because it's not a refundable charitable contribution or charitable deduction. So, and this is an interesting piece of that IRS charitable contribution, whole spectrum, is that in the IRS's eyes, not only can the historic elements of the building be characterized as a charitable contribution, but the building owner foregoing additional development on the property can also be viewed by the IRS as a charitable contribution. So we see what is commonly termed as loss of development rights. And you might encounter that associated with an open land easement. If a farmer donates 20 acres of, or donates an easement, on 20 acres of farmland, and that property owner has promised there will be no development on that farmland, that building owner has taken that similar loss of development rights. So, and then just like we have with a land easement, if you look at that picture, so you see the light gray portion, the building as it exists, some parking in the back. And then above that, you see a dark gray portion. Okay, so this is the cover page of a 30+ page study of an architect that has gone through the process of saying, okay, the zoning allows you to build up, the soils on site also allow you to build up. Here are an architect's renderings of the additional, what is that, an additional 10 or a dozen even floors of office space that you can theoretically put on top of this building and realize an additional revenue stream. So what we have in this case, the owner says, okay, I can take advantage of this revenue stream, that dark gray portion, but I am going to donate an easement that includes a loss of development rights, and I will not be able to not redevelop, but further develop this property by building up. And so that difference between what you would realize as that full building light gray and dark gray portions and what you realize as that only light gray portion is that loss of revenue. And so that loss of revenue can then be, it's part of that formula for figuring out what your charitable contribution is. You also have to have a certified appraiser that comes in and says, yes, this is what the market is, this is what that building owner could realize. And since they're not realizing that, since they're foregoing this, this is a post-development value, this is a building as it exists development value, and that difference is that loss of development. So this is kind of getting technical, and you don't really need to worry about this. If you're interested, we certainly have more information that we can provide you, but it's kind of interesting, just the way that the historic easement and the loss of development rights can work. So this is interesting because this is, and if you're thinking, oh, loss of development rights, that, you know, whoever really does that, that doesn't happen. This was an architect's rendering. I think this is in Milwaukee. It's the Scottish Rite building, the Scottish Rite Cathedral. And so the owner was proposing that mainly glass addition, what is that, an additional 10 or 12 stories above that building. So we have our historic building, our original historic building, we have the architect's rendering for a proposal to build up. So you see, actually, here's a case where there is a plan to build up on top of this building. And so this kind of illustrates how that loss of development rights could work if that building owner then went ahead and did not do that. And also interesting here in this case is an example from downtown Indianapolis. So if you look closely at this building, you can see the lower historic portion, and then you see how it's topped with new construction. So that top 5 floors of new construction represents an added cost for the building owner, but it also represents added revenue from rental of the office. So here's a case where not only was it proposed, but it was actually executed. So you have your historic building and you have your new addition above it. So it does happen. So let's touch a little bit on easement monitoring. So on an annual basis, what I do, and sometimes Joyce in our office, Devin in our office, is we go out, we have our monitoring document, and we meet with the building owner. Actually, I can show you. That's the cover of one of our monitoring documents. It's not a especially complicated form, but what we're doing is we're going out to the property every year. We're making sure that we're getting a record of the building as it exists. We're making sure that there haven't been any major changes to the building, and we want to make sure that all of those historic elements that that building contained when it was first donated in that easement are still there now. So we meet with the building owner, we go through the building, we check on the maintenance, we make note of any items that are in compliance, if any items might be out of compliance or items that need to be reviewed and looked at, and we have that as a document that we keep in our office. So like in the case of our easement on Finley, we have 14 years, well, I guess 13 years since we started monitoring in 2005. We have 13 years of monitoring documents, our annual monitoring forms. And it's actually kind of neat that we take photos each year, and we can track the evolution of the building. We can track the evolution of exterior issues, if there's stone cracking, if we see further deterioration in windows, things like that. And it really gives us a good opportunity to check what starts to become the historical record of the building, and to make sure that everything according to the terms is still being followed. So as that slide also mentions, of course, buildings aren't trapped in amber on the day that that easement agreement is executed. So we will have requests for alterations to a building. And so they come up as needed, and we deal with them as we receive those alterations in. So, okay, for example, we had one easement owner that has, the building has the original windows, and the easement owner was promised a donation if they would do replacement windows. So we're like, okay, well, let's first let's assess the condition of those existing windows, whether they're deteriorated, they're too far gone. Let's assess the proposed replacement windows to see if they are complementary to the historic character of the building. Basically, if they make the building as good or no worse from a historic character standpoint. And so in that case, with a site visit looking at the windows, we see that the windows are solid, that, yeah, they're deteriorating because the glazing is falling out, because they really haven't been maintained. They haven't been painted like they should be. The weather stripping has become worn. The weather stripping needs to be repaired. It didn't rise to a situation where the windows were so far gone that, yes, they needed to be replaced. So what we did was we used the Secretary of the Interior standards to help us evaluate the request. And we came back to that window owner and said, okay, those windows, they're really not too far gone, so we can't approve your request to replace the windows. And so instead, what we can do is give you the names of some restoration contractors who can recondition those old wood windows to function properly. They can repair broken glass, they can reglaze, they can do weather stripping, all that good stuff. And so what happened was that they made window repairs instead of window replacements. And so it's important to note that each of those requests for an alteration, it might be something real mundane, like, can we put this sign up here? And we look at it and there's no, it's not altering or damaging the historic character of the building. But sometimes we do get these requests like, can we brick in an opening, or can we replace the original windows? And then we always have to look very carefully at what that owner is proposing and try to evaluate as objectively as possible whether the change that they're suggesting is keeping with the historic character of the building. And if it's not, then we cannot approve the alteration. We have to work with them to find some sort of compromise. So let me finish up with some, I guess, some examples of our easements. And it's interesting because this is really a flexible tool that can be used by some different ownership types. This is the Toledo Club in Toledo. That easement was taken a few years ago. It's interesting because this was a case where the building's owned by a nonprofit. So they don't file taxes, they don't work with the IRS. There is no incentive on their part for a charitable contribution, or I'm sorry, for a charitable deduction off of their federal income tax. So the club instead was donating an easement to Heritage Ohio to help it facilitate donations for its continued upkeep and preservation. So we head up to Toledo every year and we work with Roger Parker there with the Toledo Club, and actually that is the easement that we have some interior rooms included in the easement, and we go over it with a fine-tooth comb, both inside and outside. This is our Finley Easement. As I was mentioning, this was the first easement that was donated to Heritage Ohio back in 2004. And I like this example because it's a smaller downtown building and it was under an LLC ownership. So there were 50 plus members of this LLC who had all made modest contributions to capitalize the company. They bought a building, fixed it up. They used the federal 20% tax credit, and they used the easement both as incentive tools to help support the cost of owning and rehabbing that building. It's interesting, just from a trivia standpoint, this was in 2004, and when we took this easement, the easement guidelines were such that the easement only covered the facade of the building. So when we do our annual monitoring every year up in Findlay, we are only concerned with the condition of the front of the building, technically, as it relates to the easement. Of course, the entire building needs to be kept in good repair so that the front of the easement, or the front of the building, is in good repair also. But technically, we are only responsible for making sure that front of the building is maintained. This is the former Naval and Marine Corps Reserve Center in Akron, Ohio. This was a case where it was the Navy that was divesting itself of this building to a municipality. So interesting that the Navy selling this building triggered what was called Section 106 process. And you don't need to know anything more except that if you are dealing with the Section 106 process, you are working to try to make sure that historic resources are preserved, or if there's anything bad that could happen to that historic building, that the chances of that bad thing happening are lessened. So in our case, we came into this when the Section 106 process entailed the request by the Navy that the city of Akron donate an easement on the building. And so, as I mentioned, the easement is the most sure way that you are going to preserve a historic building. So Heritage Ohio was approached, and Heritage Ohio, working with the city of Akron, executed an easement on this building. And so this is a municipal owner. Again, there is no IRS component to this. There was no charitable deduction, but that easement made the Navy comfortable giving the building to the city of Akron. And just with all of our other easements, we are up in Akron every year doing monitoring on this. Same with requests for alterations, that anything that the city wants to do on the site, unless it's minor, we review that request and let them know. So out of all the easements, I can say, yes, I have a favorite. And I think it's this one in downtown Columbus. And it may be for no other reason than the amazing transformation that the building underwent a few years ago. So this is now known as the Julian. It's downtown Columbus, very near the county courthouse, near the historic Westin on Main Street and High Street, I believe it is. And as you can see, that's just, see, I'm imagining these audible gasps in the audience right now, because from what it was to what it became is such a 180-degree transformation of a building. Again, I don't think these pictures do it justice. But a few years ago, if they had had an ugliest building in downtown Columbus contest, I'm sure that the Julian building would have won hands down. And even this picture doesn't do it justice for just how nasty it looked. But amazing that it transformed into something like that. And on this project, it was a federal tax credit 20%, the state tax credit 25%, and the building owner donating an easement on the building to Heritage Ohio that really helped to make the dollars work for the redevelopment. So ending on that note, that's kind of the brief introduction or overview of our easement program. You're certainly welcome to contact me if you would like to learn more. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll be discussing easements at the Cleveland conference. If you would like to join us, please do. Hope to have someone from the Gateway Neighborhood and Historic Warehouse District discussing easements, and perhaps also to have someone who can present more on the financial side of how that IRS component, the charitable contribution component of it works. So at this point, let's see, I will look and see if we have any questions. And my trusty amulet, Devin, is here to protect my webinar curse so that nothing will happen. So I see a question from Mike. Any discussion on how easement credits are monetized? So as far as the easement credits, since I am not the tax attorney, I don't want to get into that other than to say that with some of these easement programs that we've had, or I'm sorry, some of these easement donations that we've had, my understanding is that if you look at the pro forma, that end dollar amount of like financial support or what that translates into money that can go against the project or go into the project is 7 figures. So it's definitely powerful. Like for that Columbus example that I just showed you, for Columbus Examples, where you have a market where that loss of development rights is used, it's very powerful financially. But Mike, specifically, if you would like the quick lesson on that or a quick discussion, just email me on that, and I can put you in touch with people who would be much better at kind of dissecting that dollars and cents and monetization issue than I would be. So what a great non-answer, but I hope you understand. Great. So if there aren't any other questions, then I will say thank you for joining me today. We'll have this webinar uploaded to our YouTube channel probably within a matter of a few days. And in October, I think we'll have a webinar that's going to be focused on Cleveland and our upcoming conference. So stay tuned to our website, stay tuned to our e-blast, and we'll have more information. So at this point, I'll sign off. I'll say have a great rest of your day, and I hope to talk to you soon.